So I would like to talk to you today about some of the work that I did on studying long-term trajectories of social complexity. Before starting, I should just state that it will be a rather theoretical approach today. So while I am trained as an archaeologist, I will not necessarily bring you much archaeological data, but like to bring more of a theoretical framework reflection that I think might inspire some discussion with people from very different backgrounds. So I hope to throw out a wide net of approaches and bring those together to show why long-term trajectories are needed in order to understand social complexity as such. So the idea that social complexity cannot be understood without taking a long-term framework. And I will keep it mainly informal in the sense that I've left out mathematical notations as much as possible to make things accessible. With those caveats stated, let's get started. So most of us have something of an what's, let's say, intuitive understanding of what social complexity is, and the general notion that our current society is in many ways much more complex than those in the past. Over the last, let's say, 12,000 years or so, human groups, societies have changed in rather dramatic ways, going from small hunter-gatherer groups to the highly urbanized communities and industrialized nation states in a globally interconnected world that we see today. And many of these changes are typically considered from indicative, let's say, of a massive increase in social complexity. But what is social complexity, and how does it develop? Those are crucial questions that I would like to address in today's talk, and I would like to provide some outline as to how we can approach these questions. Before moving into the framework, however, I thought that I'd give a small introduction as to how social complexity has been conceptualized, theorized throughout many years of archaeological research. And I would like to go back to the, let's say, 19th century mainly, where social complexity was considered from the idea of evolutionary stages of human social development. So where there was a preconception of a very teleological process towards more complexity, very much with the idea of Western nation states at the time being at the apex of complexity formation throughout history. So these are the works of Herbert Spencer, for example, and his ideas of social Darwinism. Also Lewis Morgan with his stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, for which, of course, he considered his own European background as the apex of civilization at that point. Which these kind of ideas lasted for quite some time and were also taken up again throughout the 20th century in what's now called new evolutionary approaches, where yes, these stages of human development are still upheld, but were dissociated from necessarily teleological notions, with a focus on the underlying causes of societies moving from one stage to the next. So the idea that there's technological innovation, political organization, and increasing energy expenditure as the drivers of these stages of human development, going from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. This is still a very famous framework that was first proposed by Julian Stewart, amongst others. These kind of approaches were criticized, let's say, starting from the 1960s, not necessarily for supposing these kind of trajectories of development, but rather the fact that these were based on anthropological observations rather than archaeological ones. So from archaeology, there was a pushback, let's say, that tried to assess these kind of trajectories from archaeological data using archaeological proxies such as settlement patterns, control hierarchies, levels of organization of decision-making institutions such as the works of Ken Flannery, for example, became very prominent at that point. From the 80s onwards, we have, of course, what we call in archaeology this broad movement of post-processual thoughts as part of a wider postmodern turn, let's say, where scholars really started to emphasize the multivocal, multidimensional aspects of behavioral complexity related to everyday social practices, and the entanglement between people and their material surroundings, and this focus on microscale patterns as the main lens through which social complexity needed to be studied. These kind of approaches were not superseded, but supplemented, let's say, with ideas of resilience and sustainability that came into play really from the 90s onwards, a movement away from the microsphere towards the macrosphere of societal collapse, transformation, this idea that you have stability, you have change on a very large scale in complex societies. And in the last few decades, again, a new approach was added to that, where this idea of complex systems thinking provided, let's say, a bridge between micro-macro approaches, where by focusing really on the underlying mechanisms or drivers of social complexity, rather as a property of complex systems than as complex societies. And that's the kind of framework that I would like to build on today as well, and I have built on extensively in my work before. So the idea that complexity is a property of social systems in which the fundamental unit is the social interactions between people. Now, these interactions are in and by themselves not necessarily centralized, in the sense that you have people talking to each other and or interacting with each other, I should say. It's more than just a actual conversation, but these interactions produce a form of emergent social organization. That is a level of complex behavior that is not necessarily that cannot necessarily be reduced to the individual interaction by themselves. So it is an emergent property that comes from all of these low-level interactions. At the same time, this higher level of social organization provides feedback to these kind of interactions. So it structures the interactions as the society moves on, and the whole idea, the whole process is very much shaped by processes of information processing and decision-making strategies, and that's the kind of hook put a lot of my talk of today on as well. So how does that kind of work? This two-way socialization in complex systems. Basically, social actions, social interactions are structured. They are structured temporally, spatially, and socially, meaning that they take place at a given time, at a given place, and within a certain kind of social framework. But from these interactions, they gradually start to be coupled, gathered, bundled, whatever you want to call it, in structural ways of providing structuring means to these interactions through social practices and eventually through social organizations and institutions. Importantly and luckily for archaeologists, all of these processes have a certain kind of material expression or material reflection that we then have to start working with as archaeologists to try and infer the underlying interaction patterns, the underlying social practices, and the underlying social institutions as well. As I said, I'm not going to go into too much detail as to the archaeological side of things, so this materiality aspect will return towards the end of my talk, but for now I will leave it at that. Just another view of how this two-way socialization works. So basically you have local interaction producing an emergent multi-scale, multi-level structure in the sense of forms of social organization, institutions, administration. I will come back to later exactly as to how and why that process works. But this emergent organization has in turn a feedback loop structuring and shaping the interactions that take place on a local level as well, producing this two-way socialization process in which interactions produce, but are also produce emergent behavior, but is also structured by that same emergent behavior at the same time. Zooming in on this idea of the role of social interactions, I'd just like to point out that there's a lot of work being done or has been done in this correlation between population sizes and social complexity. The idea that as your population size grows, a society is more likely to be more complex, which is a direct result of the non-linear increase in the potential amount of interactions between people as your community grows. And there has been quite some research that correlates those two aspects, let's say. I would just like to point towards this idea of settlement scaling research that has been exploring as to how exactly and why that kind of correlation exists. So the explanation for that in the idea of settlements, but also just generally social groups as pockets of social interaction, information exchange, the idea of social systems as social reactors, basically. So that as communities grow and the number of face-to-face interactions increase, there are more outcomes in general, and those can be both positive and negative. So on the one hand, you have socioeconomic outputs that grow superlinearly compared to the total amount of social interactions, but also these social interactions generating what's called scalar stress due to limits on information processing and cognitive load. So scalar stress, which can be conceptualized as a decreasing consensus in decision making, for example, but also could be, as has been studied in scaling research, the higher amounts of crime that happen in urban settlements as well. And it's basically the threefold outcome, let's say, of lost my pointer there. The threefold outcome of energized crowding or social reactors processes being the negative one, scalar stress, the positive one, community formation, and economic growth. In our perspective here. Oh, sorry, I am. Do you still hear me? My screen froze.
We can hear you. Everything's fine.
Okay, that's weird. Then and do you see my slides moving?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. I don't see my slides moving anymore. I'm going to briefly stop sharing and start up the presentation again. Sorry for this. Okay, let's see if I am back. Yes, okay. Sorry for that. So basically the idea that settlement scaling, the underlying idea of social reactors as an explanatory framework for why more interactions lead to potentially higher complexity. So that there is, let's say, complexity or the formation of social groups happening at this interplay between, on the one hand, your increasing returns to information transmission, and on the other hand, scalar stress. So it's out of those two very much competing forces that you have the generative role of interactions as a driver of social complexity formation, because you have, on the one hand, your decreasing consensus in decision-making processes. On the other hand, your larger community sizes allowing more interactions to happen. But this is not necessarily a given development in the sense that, and I like this quote from Oban and colleagues very much, which is why I included here, that as social groups grow, they do not just simply get larger, they also self-organize to better process socially transmitted information and make more effective decisions. And that's very much crucial in all that I will be talking about today as well, because it's not just about increasing the amount of interactions, it's also about what is done with that information and how that information is part of a broader organizational whole. So the amount of social interaction, the resultant self-organization that comes from that process as well, that alone does not suffice to explain social complexity trajectories. So in my work, I developed a very simple framework based on complex systems thinking as well, that very much uses this idea of complexity as a property of human societies instead of complex societies, and try to recast the approaches in social complexity formation in archaeology through that lens. And from that idea, I basically define social complexity as the extent to which a social entity can exploit, process, and consume flows of energy, resources, and information. And to that end, to explore that definition, I developed a model of complexity formation that consists of or starts from internal and external selection pressures. For example, the need for subsistence, competition between groups, the production and distribution of goods, etc., which act as input information for a decision-making process. And decision-making process using causal mechanisms, specifically diversification, integration, and specialization. I will come back to those in a bit, which act as either pulling or pushing forces that respectively develop or induce the aggregation and dispersal of these flows of energy, resources, and information. And it's these flows that shape these kind of social complexity trajectories that I'm talking about. And just as a side note a bit to that, so in this framework, social complexity very much has both a social and a natural dimension, meaning that complexity sets or social complexity developed in the sense of the exploitation of these flows sets the boundaries for social development, but also its potential environmental impact by trying to reach the whatever is possible within those boundaries in and by themselves. To make that model dynamic, so to further explore how complexity originates and how it develops, I turned to an existing model of social complexity as a problem-solving tool, something very much developed by Geoffrey Hervilla, but also by Joseph Tainter, amongst others, which basically develops the decision-making and information processing component of the model. Where complex organizational structures are basically the result of an iterative process. An iterative process consisting of situational events that act as input information. That input information is feed into a decision-making process that results in certain kinds of trajectories or outcomes shaping complexity in specific ways. So what does that mean? Basically, we have a given situation, a society, faced with a situational event, which is defined as broadly as possible, where a certain kind of action or strategy is needed to be developed in order to handle this situation. Can be climate change, for example, can be a competitive community that is acting violently, or it can also be internal, whatever. And this change is then addressed in a way that, for example, new forms of administration, social organization, internal stratification, for example, is being developed. And basically, through these interactive or recurrent loops, you have basically two trajectories. You have a fast process of very opportunistic decision-making through collective action measures. For example, there is this rival community that is posing a threat and that needs to be addressed now. And for that reason, certain kinds of processes or structures are devised. On the other hand, these fast loops are feeding into a more slow process of either social political development or decay. So the amassment of social political structures and subdivisions as a result of these fast loops. Within this kind of framework, there's a big importance allotted to what's called the initial stimuli. So the idea that these initial stimuli have a huge impact on subsequent community formation, because initial sunk costs and development of what you could call an interlocked system of interests give rise to certain kinds of pathways of development. Once certain kinds of choices are being made, the system is induced towards a certain direction for which it's difficult to get out of and reach a new kind of system state. What's interesting in this kind of model is also that there is a possibility for failure at every step of the iteration. So this is the typical trajectory, let's say, of a situational event as an input stimuli for decision making, for action to be taken, for that action to be, let's say, solidified and be taken part of as the main system. But at each of those steps, there is the possibility for failure. A society could fail to recognize the necessary input stimuli, let's say climate change. If your society does not recognize the changes, the input information, and does not act accordingly, then the possibility for that society to not be able to sustain itself is very much real in this in this kind of a model. And that's important because social complexity is not a given. It's something that is not necessarily a process of increasing complexity in every society. It needs to be part of this increasingly or increased recurrence of these kind of iterant loops, and it's very important to realize that at any point there is the inherent risk of complexity not being manifested, let's say. A small word on these kind of situational events that trigger these kind of loops. Situational events that provide stimuli and input information for societal change. As said, they can be both internal and external. They drive change. They can be hailing from a social dimension or the environmental dimension. Doesn't really matter. But basically, they provide the stimulus, the input stimulus for a society to develop in such a way that we assess or assign the label of complexity to it. More information processing, more governmental structures, more administration, etc., etc. Now, the thing with these kind of stimuli is that they tend to stick around, or at least I should say the outcomes of the stimuli tend to stick around. So the idea is that once the stimuli, the driving factor is gone, let's say the external competitor that comes in, once that competitor is gone, the normal assumption might be that a complex situation will then simplify because the need for this development is no longer there. However, simplification in general is quite rare in human societies, and that's because these pathways of development very often lead to this increased internal lock-in of social structures in which each subsequent system state, let's say, is more complex than the last one. So that's something to be very much aware of as well. And that's why we have very often in these long-term trajectories, we have what's called a continued accumulation of information capacity. This capacity allows increasing or increases the ability of a society to exploit resources, energy, and information within a society, basically inducing kind of positive feedback loop. So where you have more information processing apparatus capacity, you have a society that is better able to exploit these resources and energies sources that it needs. However, of course, the system always has its kind of limits. Those limits can be energetic. They come from the environment. There is no more energy or resources to be gained at a certain point without the risk of overshoot, of crossing the carrying capacity of the landscape as well. But also there is an adaptive limit to it. So complexity as a problem-solving tool very much starts from the idea of adaptation. So adaptation within a dynamic relationship between society and environment in many cases, but also is very much tied to the idea of maladaptation. And again, I put a quote here, because every iteration of that loop that we just saw basically superimposes subsequent strategies and solutions that eventually will generate multiple and partially overlapping structures of administration, laws, measures of social political organization, as well as an intricate set of social norms and values, but also various avenues of communication between people, groups, and administration, all of which are very costly to maintain. They're also subject to diminishing marginal returns on investment. So the idea being that as you superimpose all of these layers of apparatus, at some point, it's very difficult to maintain all of these structures of administration. And that's when the idea of maladaptation to a certain kind of environment comes into play. As soon as a new situational event arises, which requires a lot more flexibility, which is no longer possible within this kind of interconnected and rigid system state, that's when your society has a big problem. And I think here lies a bit of the root to also the introduction that Andreas gave as to the wider idea of this seminar series as to the kind of emergent institutionalized framework that also in and by itself that allows growing complexity, but also in and by itself carries already the root of potential collapse as well. A small word on the social complexity mechanisms that I conceptualized. So the idea that you have information processing and decision-making strategies basically are driven by three causal mechanisms. You have diversification, you have connectivity, and you have specialization. Diversification basically induces differentiation within and between social systems. Integration is basically that which connects system components and produces the interactions that generates emergent behavior. And intensification refers to the relative investment of time, energy, and resources in any given process. So together, you have these mechanisms that shape the accumulation and dispersal of these flows of energy, resources, and information, driving social complexity trajectories, both in increasing complexity as in decreasing complexity. So it's a two-way process in that sense. And it's a process that happens on multiple social scales as well. So this is a framework that intrinsically can be applied both to the level of the individual community as a larger scale polity. In essence, though, the main, let's say, structuring framework remains the same, although of course the drivers and the specific strategies do differ. I will skip the more broader explanation of the mechanisms because I don't think I will make it towards the end in time otherwise. I just want to connect basically this idea with going back to the idea of materiality as well. So as archaeologists, of course, we have to be aware that a lot of this framework that I have been talking about today, a lot of that remains out of reach in the sense that we work primarily with the material remnants of the past. And for a lot of, at that point, my PhD work was about pondering this question, how to move basically from sherds to complexity. I started out as an archaeologist studying very much material culture, pottery, broken pieces of pots lying around, but I always had this wider framework of social complexity in my mind, but it was difficult to connect those things. And I think the main or the best way forward towards that, and of course this is all still work in progress in the sense that these ideas are still being shaped and constantly reshaped, hopefully also by more discussion later today. But basically, I think the main linchpin there is information. Information, in which in its most basic entropic sense is physical ordering. But also means, for me, more relevantly, that information is inherently deposited in all objects, all structures that form the setting of human life. And that also means that people can use objects and structures to communicate messages and to transmit information, process information, and also transmit knowledge. And that's interesting because it also means that we can interpret those material remnants in a way as to try and find their informational values for societies in the past as well. Now, I'm not going to show you any archaeological things more specifically, so I am staying on a broader theoretical level. But this is not necessarily something new. So this idea of material culture as an information transmission system was already developed in the 60s by Clark, amongst others. The idea that you have your artifact as the manifestation of, on the one hand, the behavior of the producer or the intentions of the producer, as well as the behavior of the users, the people that actually use this material culture in doing certain kinds of ways. So this one artifact contains information from two sides, and it's that information that we can, as archaeologists, use to try and interpret the past as well. So this idea also relates to Sherry's theories of science, so with the concepts built around the concepts of designata. A artifact that contains a set of roles or activities with that needs to inform its inherent function, but at the same time also percepta, which is the information conveyed to an observer in the act of perceiving an object or an artifact, and how that observer might use that object as well, which is then related to concepta, which is the information contained in the abstract idea of a object conceived from memory. So previous usages of such objects and what they actually mean within a broader social framework. So a very different framework to look at the informational content of material culture in many different ways, which I find very interesting to also connect to this idea of social complexity on that level. The materiality of complexity also plays out on the broader level of structures and settlements, where Structures, settlements are the manifestation of, let's say, recurrent needs and goals. Because recurrent needs and goals, and this is again this linking back to this idea of interactions bundled in practices and institutions as a kind of emergent factor. Basically, these recurrent needs and goals, so the idea that you have interactions that occur many times so that they are bundled into practice and then institutions, they require or they induce order. Let's say they're a way of structuration, of a way of allowing more of these kind of interactions to happen, while also reducing, let's say, the entropy related to each individual interaction by itself. And that's where the use of space in a material environment comes into play as a way of structuring these interactions, as well as a way of differentiating between social groups, between household members, for example, but also shaping interaction possibilities, formalizing spaces as a way to, let's say, develop administrative processes as well. And that ties into the idea that you have within a social group, within a social settlement, you always have an information overload. Social interactions are happening. They're a driver of social complexity in many ways. And in principle, anyone could, within that group, can interact with anyone else within the system. However, in practice, that's not always possible. So that means that information selection is an inherent feature of any kind of social group formation. And that's an interesting problem, I think, to bring as well, because then it becomes a matter of who select or what kind of interactions are being selected, what kind of interactions are being formalized within a given community. And a lot of that work has been done, for example, from the perspective of Marxist archaeology, basically talking about who gets to have the power to select information and why, and whether that is a top-down or a bottom-up emergent coordination of actions or a top-down imposition of these kind of selection procedures is I think an important matter to consider at that point as well. And I would like to tie that as the last element for my talk. I would like to tie that to the ideas of Ronald Fletcher, who has been working a lot on settlement trajectories through time and space. But I would like to specifically refer to a talk of his that I saw last year at the URCnet seminars. I'm not sure if it's actually published, but where he's talking about material prerequisites as an element of these kind of trajectories of development for these settlements. The idea that you have certain kinds of elements within a society that facilitate interaction and communication within larger social groups. The act of or the usage of symbols, symbology, the invention of writing, for example, but also the usage of durable building materials as a way of structuring interaction possibilities and movement within a society as well. But basically also ties that into the idea that, yes, many of these elements are being developed as a way to facilitate interaction and communication, but that basically they allow these kind of transitions to happen, and that the original framework of these prerequisites is not necessarily the eventual function of these things. So the invention of the printing press as a way of disseminating information was not necessarily or did not necessarily happen with the idea of it producing or inducing a revolution in society in many different ways. The making information available on a much higher scale than previously thought of was a byproduct, let's say, of the invention of the printing press, not necessarily its immediate intention from the start. And that comes together in what is called, or what Fletcher calls, the interaction communication matrix, the idea that settlement trajectories play out on several scales, but within those scales you can basically observe thresholds that emerge out of the interplay between the maximum density versus the maximum distance that allows social interactions to sustain a cohesive social group. And basically you have different communication systems, different forms of social organization that have different limits imposed to the amount of density is actually allowed. For example, the mobile hunter-gatherer groups have a different information density threshold compared to sedentary groups, but also the kinds of communication system, writing versus printing press versus telecommunications, allow different forms of densities as well. And the idea being that as your community density increases, there's a higher stress, again, referring back to that scalar stress idea as well, where you need to basically transition into a new regime, or your society will not be able to sustain that high density level. And it's that interplay that basically generates, or that you could loosely correlate to what's called punctuated equilibrium in development as well. And on that note, I would like to basically conclude my talk, because the perspectives that are brought together, I would like to loosely connect those as a reflection on both linear and cyclical models of complexity formation, where you have, on the one hand, these kind of cyclical models, such as the adaptive cycle. Not to extensively talk about or explicitly talk about that, but it has been present in the background of a lot of my approach as well, where basically you have system development that runs through certain kinds of stages, and is basically also a reflection of these kind of boom-bust models. However, here the main difference being that after the bust in a cyclical model, the recombination of existing properties with some kind of innovation coming in produces a new cycle. So where here you have your distinct or individual phases of development and decline, which doesn't necessarily link towards each other. And I think a lot of the approaches that, or ideas that I've presented today, kind of connects those two things. It basically reshifts the focus on not necessarily on the boom and the bust in and by itself, but on the rates and the magnitudes of change, expressing a strong or a stronger interest into what actually causes these kind of trajectories as well, with the realization that you have many different potential trajectories that social complexity can develop alongside. So the idea that you have a lot of different potential selection pressures, causal mechanisms as drivers of change, that basically requires us to think about how an individual society develops or developed in the past, but all revolving around these concepts that are very important. So these trade-offs between decision-making processes, particularly between diversification as a mechanism versus integration and intensification. I think there lies some potential to explain this divergent development, with integration and intensification leading to a strong increase in social complexity in many ways, diversification as a main driver being a property maybe perhaps of equilibrium. But also the idea that social complexity formation tends to increase due to some cost effects and feedback loops, but also comes with a cost. So social complexity induces higher human impact on the environment through the capturing of more extensive flows of energy and resources. But also on a social level, it increases interconnectivity, inequality, leading to a more rigid social system, and making the potential for innovation and resilience of a society to decrease over time as well. And I think for all of these ideas, and I did say I would tie them loosely together, long-term perspectives are very much needed. So the ideas and the frameworks are there. A lot of the archaeological data is there as well to look at how societies actually played out over these longer timeframes. But as a critical note for my own discipline, I will end with just saying that putting those two together and basically compiling all of the archaeological data in a way that allows quantitative study is still a big challenge for archaeologists. And I think it's the main challenge that we will face moving forward. But that if we are able to overcome this challenge, that I think will be a major factor in archaeologists able to move beyond our own discipline, let's say, and also contribute to broader debates of social complexity in the present as well as in the future. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much welcome all questions, comments, and discussions. Thank you.